12. We'll spend our time in Luke chapter 12. There are certain chapters and actually certain books that are difficult, certain chapters that are challenging, but Luke chapter 12 is one that I find particularly challenging. The wording isn't overly complicated, the subject matter isn't overly hard, but it demands so much in chapter 12 that it's hard to deal with. And so we're going to do that today. We're going to try to deal with it a little bit. I don't have all of the answers for Luke chapter 12, but I hope that it's beneficial, the little bit that we can dive into. I don't know how you guys always conduct your studies. I know that I like to underline and I like to color coordinate. And I've chosen for Luke chapter 12, just by random chance, orange to be the color for the lack of anxiety or lack of fear. And there's quite a bit of chapter 12 that is colored in orange. He starts here in verse 4. We'll read verses 4 through 7. And we'll kind of go section by section over the first half of chapter 12. He says in verse 4, "I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and then after that have nothing more that they can do. But I warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he has killed, has the authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? And not one of them is forgotten before God. Why, even the hairs of your head are numbered. Fear not, you are more valuable than many sparrows." Here Jesus is going to begin his discord on the lack of fear and lack of anxiety here in Luke chapter 12. And he starts off with a pretty big one where he says, "I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body." Notice that he doesn't say that they're not going to be able to. He just says, don't fear them. And that's the hard one. He mentions here to fear God more than them. And Daniel, especially Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, comes to mind specifically when it comes to individuals who fear God more than those who kill the body. We won't take our time to go and spend a whole lot of time in Daniel because we got quite a bit of Luke chapter 12 to get through. But remember what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego deal with there in Daniel, where the edict is given out that they need to bow themselves whenever they hear all these musical instruments. And they make the statement that God can save them from the fiery furnace. But if he doesn't, let it be known that we're still not going to bow down. And I think that really, in my mind, highlights what he's dealing with in these few verses. They knew that there was a real possibility that they would be killed. How certain they were that God would save them, they knew for certain that God could save them. But there's a lot of people that God chose not to save sometimes. I mean, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego all were taken before the full captivity. You have the Babylonians who came in and they had handpicked some of the officials, some of the noblemen's sons, to go and to serve in the courts in Babylon. This was before the whole deportation. But whenever you get to the deportation, not everyone gets deported. I mean, you have battles where thousands of people die. And yet still, God calls for them to not fear. Jesus, in a few chapters, is going to be killed himself, fearing more about God than those who kill him. All of the apostles are going to die a kind of premature death. Judas being the exception of his own hands, and then John dying in prison years later. But all of the other ones, all 10, 11 including Paul, are going to die at the hands of somebody else before natural causes. And yet Jesus talks to them here in chapter 12 and says, don't fear. You have a persecution that arises in Acts chapter 8 that is going to scatter the church to the kind of the 4 winds of the world. And yet he still tells them, don't fear. I don't think that means that you can't have any butterflies in the stomach, you can't have any nerves about what's going to happen. but in comparison to your fear of God, to not let that rule who you are, to not live your life out of fear for this particular occasion. And so he repeats them again here at the end of verse 7. Fear not, for you are more valuable than many sparrows. If you look here in verses 8 through 12, he says there, I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God. But the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. And everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, and the one who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. And when they bring you into the synagogues and into the rulers, before the rulers and authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourselves or what you should say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to. We see here at the beginning of chapter 12 that the direct context is specifically the 12 apostles. And so I think the last phrasing here in verse 12, that the Holy Spirit's going to teach them that very hour what to say, is a promise that was given directly to the 12 apostles. But this idea of acknowledging Jesus before men is universal through the church. We see that in Acts chapter 8 with the Ethiopian eunuch. That was what he was asked to profess before being baptized. We see in Romans chapter 10, he mentions there that with confession, or with the mouth, we confess unto salvation. The same thing happens here in Luke chapter 12. There are times where individuals will be anxious about acknowledging Jesus before other people, acknowledging themselves as being Christians. And we know historically people have died for those simple words that I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And sometimes that has been their very last words on this earth, is making that statement. And yet what he tells them is, in verse 11, is don't be anxious. And the same principle applies in the previous verses, to fear God more than those who can just simply kill the body. He then continues in verses 13 down through verse 21. And while if you're going to notice here in these verses, he doesn't mention anxiety, he doesn't mention fear, but given the context, there's a really good reason that this is where it is here in Luke. And so someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. But he said to him, Man, who made me a judge over you, or an arbitrator? And he said, Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist of the abundance of his possessions. And he told him a parable, saying, The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store up my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns, and I will build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And he said to his soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax and eat and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? And so the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich, so thus is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich towards God. And he mentions very clearly in verse 15 that one's life does not consist of the abundance of possessions, but how many times do people live in fear of losing that? I don't know what all this man was thinking here in this parable. We have some insight. But many times people who are unwilling to share or unwilling to be generous is because they fear a lack of that for themselves sometime in the future. Here is, we have another account of individuals who are poor, who have this rich man who's in abundance. And we see that same principle play out. Sometimes we live our life ever with anxiety over possessions or fear over a loss of security. And yet Jesus tells us very clearly in verse 15 that your life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. And then again in verse 21, so is the one who lays up treasures for himself and not towards God. When it comes to fear and anxiety, possessions usually drive a large percentage of those fears and anxieties. Whether it's having yourself killed here at the very beginning of chapter 12, or acknowledging publicly before others that you believe in Jesus, or the loss of possessions here in chapter 12. And then the last section is verse 22 down through about verse 30, 33, 34. He says to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Consider the ravens, that they neither sow nor reap, and yet they neither have storehouses or barns, and yet God feeds them. For how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to the span of your life? If then you were not able to do a small thing like that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, and yet I tell you, even Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and is tomorrow that's thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat, and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek first the kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." And so he tells them here in verse 33, to sell your possessions, give to the needy, provide for yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure that is in heaven and does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. 3 times in this section, in verse 22, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life. He asks the question in verse 26, why are you anxious about the rest? And then verse 32, fear not. And so if we're kind of keeping tally, verse 4, fear not. Verse 7, fear not. Verse 11, have no anxiety. Verse 22, do not be anxious. Verse 26, why are you anxious? And then verse 32, fear not. And this is why I find chapter 12 so challenging, because it's not, just simply be generous. It's not just show up to church on Sundays. It's not just give a little bit. It is dealing with our innermost thoughts. How oftentimes do we fear life itself? Some of us probably a bit more than others, given some of our work experiences. How often are we afraid to do things that are good because of what may happen? We all struggle with that, I think, to some degree. Whether it's straight up being killed, as he mentions in verse 4, or the criticism or the ridicule or whatever may happen by us acknowledging and going out and doing good in verses 8 and following, or the abundance of good that we could be doing, but we hold back because of our own desire or own fears of God's provision in the future, as he speaks in verses 13 and following, or just the daily necessities of life, verses 22 and following. And part of it is a proper perspective. Fear has a lot to do with faith. And I think a couple things we can glean from chapter 12 is that fear shows wrong priorities, which is really hard to kind of grapple with, because in verse 4, the priority is our own life. And to us, that seems the most natural of all priorities. Of course I want to go. And Paul, while he doesn't wrestle with the fear of this in Philippians, he acknowledges some of the wrestling in his mind. In Philippians, he's waiting not to find out whether or not he's going to be killed. And he says, well, my desire is to go and be with God, but also I know that if I stay, I get to do a lot more work for you guys. And so sometimes we wrestle our mind, well, if I live and if I survive through, if I just don't die, then I get to do all this extra good stuff. That'd be really nice. And sometimes we hide our fear from ourselves under the mask of, well, this is only for the opportunity of doing good. But Jesus makes us challenge that thought process with asking ourselves, do you fear those who kill you more than God? The same thing comes up, the priorities when it comes to the possessions, verses 13 and following. What anxiety we have about that. Jesus highlights that even further as you get down to verses 22. Don't be anxious about your life. And then he doesn't deal with the excess, he deals with the bare necessities. Don't be anxious about what you eat or your body, what you put on. For life is more than clothing, the body is more than food. Now, those things are hard. He also here deals with that faith, or that fear shows a lack of faith. Lack of faith that God is going to continue to provide, or that what God chooses to do with our life is really going to be what's best. How hard is that to accept for the apostles that, I'm going to send Peter out here and he's going to be arrested and he's going to be crucified upside down, and that's what's best for his life. That's what's happening at the end of John, where John and Peter are standing there, and Jesus has this conversation with Peter, do you love me? Yes, I love you. Then go feed my sheep. And then he turns to John and tells him, when you're old, you're not going to be able to choose when to dress yourself or not. Or where he has that conversation with Peter. And he says, this is the death that you're going to glorify God with. And this is what's best for you. And Peter has to accept and has faith that God's choosing to have him die young is what's best for him, which is really hard. As you get towards the end of the book of Kings, 2 Kings, you have the last really good king of Judah. And God tells him, as a reward for his good, faithful service, he's going to die young, so that he doesn't have to see his kingdom fall into the hands of the Babylonians. That is hard. As rewards go, that seems like a really, really short end of the stick. But it's what God chose was best for him. And so when he tells us, don't be anxious about your life, or your clothing, or your possessions, or your food, we have to have the faith that whatever God chooses for us to go through is best. What if you were Naomi's husband? I don't know the order of her husband and her sons dying, but to have to go through a famine that God chose that is best for the nation of Israel, then to go and to live in the land of Moab and have your sons marry foreigners, and then for you to die, and then for both of your sons to die, so that God can choose what is best to bring Ruth into the lineage of Jesus. Terribly hard. And that's what I find so challenging about Luke chapter 12. Is it demands a lot more of me than I'm automatically, happily willing to forfeit. But it doesn't. I want to temper some of these thoughts with some other biblical teaching at the same time. It doesn't mean that Christians seek after death. It's not that they all seek martyrdom, where he doesn't say here in verse 4, don't fear those who kill the body, and then run directly at them and willfully give yourself up to them. Paul flees out of a window and is let down in a basket to save his life. The same thing happens and as you get over into Acts chapter 8, as the persecution arises in Jerusalem, they don't just stay there waiting to die. They do scatter. They're not individuals who are looking for death. And they had to balance that, and I don't know how that works. And there are some who remained in Jerusalem, and there are some who left. Now, who chose to stay and who chose to go? I don't know. Are there some who stayed behind Jerusalem and call those who left cowards, who feared for their life? I don't know that either. Or are those who left say, well, this is part of God's plan for his gospel to be spread, and I'm going to do that. Again, I don't know the exact scenario, but they had to wrestle with themselves over their fear of those who kill the body and just taking simple precautions. It doesn't mean that Christians sought poverty either. And what Jesus tells them here to sell your possessions and to give to the needy here in verse 33, it's not a sell everything you have, but it's the idea of being willing to give, and being willing to give in abundance at times. We see that at the beginning of the church, where they sold their extras. But at the same time, you also see people who continue to be business owners, individuals who still continue to work and still continue to gather more monetary possessions so that in the future they can then do more with it later. So it's not a vow of poverty, it's not a seeking of a martyrdom, nor is it taking normal precautions. I mean, he doesn't say here, don't take precautions. In fact, if you get over into, is it Matthew chapter 10? Where Jesus tells them, I'm going to send them out, here in verses 16 and following. They're going to take precautions. We see that all the time. When there's a riot that comes up in Ephesus, and they're looking for Paul. And Paul's going to go out. He's going to go and face the mob. And they restrain Paul so that he doesn't get hurt. And those are our normal precautions to take. But they were to always fear God more. And they weren't to stop living their life out of their fear of losing their life. And they weren't ever to compromise their faith or the truth or morality because of their fear. I think that's what we see in Daniel. Daniel only had to compromise just a smidgen. 30 days without prayer. That is so small compared to your life, seemingly. But yet he wasn't going to compromise at all of his morality or the truth in order to save his life. In Matthew chapter 10, verses 16 down through verse 19, Jesus says, Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my name's sake, to bear witness before them to the Gentiles. And when they deliver you over, do not be anxious of how you will speak or what you will say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. Again, the context again is the 12 apostles directly. He tells them that I'm sending you out to be innocent as doves, but still be as wise or as crafty as serpents. Normal precaution, it's still something that he's advocating. He tells them in verse 17 to beware of them. Even in their attempts to beware, they're still going to be captured and flogged and beaten, but still, it was worth it. And it doesn't mean that, as you look at Luke chapter 12, it doesn't mean that there weren't unusual times and strange circumstances. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul is dealing with marriage, and he's specifically getting into the topic of those who are betrothed, and he tells them in verse 25, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one whom by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy, and I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. There is some unusual circumstances in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that is making them alter their lives, at least in the extent of marriage. Not in this extent of morality, because he says later on, if it becomes a matter of morality, with sexual morality, then you just go ahead and get married. But there were certain times there were unusual circumstances that they had to live under, and sometimes their actions were altered and changed by that. So, now we get back to Luke chapter 12, and the big question of all of it. When we deal with faith and fear and normal precaution, I don't have the magic recipe for what that looks like. There were some, I believe, who probably have fled in fear and were wrong to do so. There were some who probably stayed out of courage and foolishness and maybe should have fled out of normal precaution without fearing. And I don't know exactly who that is and when that is the case. All I know is that whatever we choose to do in life, our command here in Luke chapter 12 and verse 4, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who can kill the body. But in verse 5, I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who after he has killed has the authority to cast into hell. And yes, I tell you to fear him. I know for certain in verse 22 that as we struggle with the question of how much should I work, how much wage should I try to earn, and all my efforts to work for my family or supply the needs of those around me, I still can't be anxious about it. So if I choose to work overtime, or if I choose to be gone from my family a long time to do my work, or I choose not to do that, I have to have that governed to some degree by my anxiety. Whatever the case may be, am I working overtime because I'm anxious? Am I gaining more money to save up for the future because I'm anxious? I don't know the case. I mean, that's something that you have to really wrestle with personally. When it comes to your statements of Jesus before others, being willing to acknowledge him before men and to suffer the consequences of their ridicule or their rejection or the backlash, or even to the point of them being beaten and thrown into prison, that cannot be governed by anxiety. That just cannot be the case for us who profess Jesus. And the same thing comes up in verse 32 where he makes this blanket statement, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." And I don't have all the right answers for this unusual circumstance. I certainly can't say that precaution is wrong, because we see that through the entire Bible of individuals who were precautious. I can't say that unusual circumstances don't call for slightly altered ways of life, because we see that as well. But I have to say here, as I look at Luke chapter 12, it can't be in fear. There's a difference between precaution and reasonable action and fear and anxiety. And whatever we choose to do, not only in this particular time, but in all aspects of our life, kind of moving forward, fear cannot be the main thing that dictates what we do and don't do. Faith has to be the thing that dictates it. And how that plays out in your particular life is something that you have to work through. And there is no magic formula for that, which is why we had the principles laid out for us here in Luke chapter 12, and that all the individuals who lived thereafter had to work through that. At what point in time does precaution turn into fear? I don't know that answer for you. At what point in time does reasonable action turn into unreasonable lack of faith? Again, I don't know the answer. But that's something that's really, really worth considering. And in Luke chapter 12, Jesus doesn't promise them great times moving forward. In fact, he promises quite the opposite. But whatever times they find themselves in, do not fear in verse 4. Verse 7, fear not. Verse 11, do not be anxious. Verse 32, do not be anxious. And in verse 32, fear not. I mean, the pattern is unchanged through the entire chapter, regardless if it's money or backlash from speaking the truth about Jesus, or even their life themselves, or the very bare necessities of life. Whatever the case may be, the answer is don't fear. And I really would challenge us all to take some time and to ask ourselves, what is it that we do out of fear, and what is it that we don't do out of fear? And ask ourselves, should we, or how can we change to make that not be the case? If our lives are not to be dictated by fear, but by faith, how can I change my fear into faith? Because that's what chapter 12 is all about, and I find it so challenging to do that. So that was my non-help for you guys today, is to not give answers, but to raise more questions in your mind about what makes you conduct your life the way that you do. Either both in the positive sense of what you do and the negative sense of what you don't do out of fear. And what could you do by faith? The world was changed by the audience of chapter 12. 12 men who were told not to fear and to live their life extraordinary so that others can learn the gospel and thereby change the entire world, and it worked. What can we do if we gave up our fear and had faith? So, thank you.